When I woke up gasping for air with my lungs on fire, I thought I was having a nightmare, but the acrid smell burning my throat and the haze clouding my bedroom told me this was real. My stepmother Diane had mixed bleach and ammonia in a spray bottle and doused my entire room while I slept. What she didn't know was that I had installed a hidden camera 3 weeks earlier, and what happened next changed everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Zoe Harper, and at 17 I should have been worried about prom dates and college applications. Instead, I was documenting evidence of psychological warfare happening under my own roof. The morning everything went wrong started like any other Tuesday in our Beaverton home. Dad left for his construction site at dawn, Chloe was already at Portland State for her morning classes, and Diane was in the kitchen humming while she prepared what looked like her daily cleaning routine. I had learned to read the signs. When Diane hummed, it usually meant she was planning something. When she gathered cleaning supplies before 8 in the morning, it meant her target was me. But that day felt different. There was an edge to her movements, a deliberation that made my stomach clench with familiar anxiety. The house we lived in was a modest 2-story with cream siding and a red front door that Dad had painted himself when he and Diane got married 2 years ago. My room was on the second floor, directly above the kitchen with windows that faced the backyard where Mom used to grow tomatoes before she passed. Diane had ripped out those plants within a month of moving in, replacing them with decorative rocks and a fountain that never worked properly. I grabbed my backpack and headed downstairs, hoping to slip out before any interaction was necessary. Diane stood at the kitchen island, blonde hair pulled back in a tight ponytail, wearing yoga pants and a pristine white tank top. She looked like she belonged in a home improvement commercial, all polished surfaces and artificial warmth. "Morning, Zoe," she said without looking up from the array of bottles and containers spread across the granite countertop. "Running late again?" I wasn't running late. School didn't start for another hour, but I had developed the habit of leaving early to avoid these exact conversations. "Just want to get there early for study group," I replied, reaching for a banana from the fruit bowl. She finally looked at me, her pale blue eyes scanning from my sneakers to my messy ponytail. "You know, I was thinking your room could use a deep clean today. Spring cleaning, even though it's October, fresh start and all that." My hand froze halfway to the banana. Diane's version of deep cleaning my room had become a monthly ritual of invasion. She would rearrange my belongings, throw away items she deemed unnecessary, and somehow always manage to lose or damage things that meant something to me. Last month, she had accidentally donated my mother's jewelry box to Goodwill. The month before, she had used industrial strength cleaner on my desk, permanently staining the wood surface where Mom and I used to do homework together. "I can clean it myself this weekend," I offered, keeping my voice neutral. "I know where everything goes." Diane's smile tightened. "Oh, sweetie, I don't mind, besides you have such a busy schedule with school and everything. Let me take care of it." The way she said take care of it made my skin crawl. There was something predatory in her tone, like she was discussing removing a pest rather than cleaning a room. I wanted to argue, to establish some boundary, but I had learned that confronting Diane directly only made things worse. She had a gift for making me look like the unreasonable one, the difficult stepdaughter who couldn't appreciate her stepmother's generous efforts. Dad had heard this narrative so many times that he had started automatically siding with her before I could even finish explaining my side. "Okay," I said, shouldering my backpack, "just please don't move the photos on my nightstand. They're arranged how I like them." "Of course not, honey. I would never touch anything important to you." The lie rolled off her tongue so smoothly that for a split second I almost believed her. But I had heard this exact promise before, usually right before discovering that something meaningful had mysteriously disappeared or been damaged beyond repair. I walked to Lincoln High through the tree-lined streets of our neighborhood, past houses with perfectly manicured lawns and 2-car garages. Everything looked normal from the outside, just like our house did. Just like our family did when Dad was around. The October air was crisp and clean, a sharp contrast to the suffocating atmosphere I had left behind. At school I tried to focus on calculus and American literature, but my mind kept drifting back to Diane's expression when she talked about cleaning my room. There had been something different about it, something more intense than her usual passive-aggressive boundary violations. During lunch, I sat with my best friend Natalie in our usual spot by the windows overlooking the courtyard. You look like you're planning someone's murder, Natalie observed, unwrapping her sandwich. Everything okay at home? Natalie was the only person who really understood what living with Diane was like. She had been there for the gradual escalation over the past 2 years, from small comments and subtle undermining to the current state of psychological warfare. Her own parents had divorced when she was younger, so she recognized the signs of adults using children as emotional battlegrounds. Diane's doing her deep cleaning thing again today, I said, picking at my salad without appetite. I don't know why, but something felt off about it this morning. Like she was looking forward to it more than usual. Did you ever figure out what happened to your mom's necklace last time? I shook my head. The silver locket with my mother's photo inside had vanished during Diane's previous cleaning session. When I asked about it, she had looked genuinely confused and suggested that maybe I had misplaced it myself. She had even helped me search for it, making concerned noises and offering to replace it with something new. The performance had been so convincing that I almost doubted my own memory of where I had left it. Maybe you should talk to your dad again, Natalie suggested. He has to see what's happening eventually. He sees what he wants to see, and what he wants to see is his perfect new wife taking care of his difficult daughter out of the goodness of her heart. The bitterness in my voice surprised me. I had been working so hard to keep my emotions in check around Dad that I had almost convinced myself I wasn't angry. The truth was, I missed my father. Not just because he was physically absent more often since marrying Diane, but because he had become emotionally unavailable in a way that hurt more than I wanted to admit. Before Diane, Dad and I had been a team. We cooked dinner together, watched terrible action movies on Friday nights, and talked about everything from school drama to my college plans. Now our conversations felt scripted and careful, like we were both afraid of saying something that might upset the delicate balance Diane had created. After school, I walked home slowly, dreading what I might find. The house looked the same from the outside, but as soon as I opened the front door, the smell hit me. It was sharp and chemical, like someone had dumped a bottle of bleach in a swimming pool. My eyes immediately started watering, and I felt a burning sensation in my throat. Diane, I called out, my voice already hoarse from the fumes. Up here, sweetie. Her voice drifted down from the second floor, unnaturally cheerful. Just finishing up your room. I climbed the stairs with growing dread, the chemical smell getting stronger with each step. By the time I reached my bedroom doorway, my eyes were streaming, and I was having trouble breathing normally. The smell was so intense it felt like it was coating the inside of my lungs with acid. My room had been transformed into something that belonged in a medical facility rather than a home. Every surface gleamed with wetness, and the air was thick with fumes that made my vision blur. Diane stood in the center of it all, wearing rubber gloves and what looked like a painter's mask, holding an industrial spray bottle filled with a cloudy yellow liquid. Surprise, she announced, her voice muffled by the mask. I gave everything a really thorough cleaning. Used some professional-grade products to make sure we got rid of any bacteria or allergens. I tried to step into the room, but the fumes were so strong they made me dizzy. What did you use? It smells like a chemical plant in here. Oh, just a mixture of things. Bleach, ammonia-based cleaner, some industrial disinfectant I found at the hardware store. Really powerful stuff, much more effective than those gentle household cleaners. The words hit me like a physical blow. Even I knew that mixing bleach and ammonia was dangerous. We had learned about it in chemistry class just last month when Mr. Peterson was explaining chemical reactions. The combination created chlorum gas, which could cause severe respiratory damage and could be fatal in enclosed spaces. Diane, you can't mix bleach and ammonia, I said, backing away from the doorway. It creates toxic gas, that's why the smell is so bad. She paused in her spraying and looked at me with what appeared to be genuine surprise. Really, I had no idea. I just wanted to make sure everything was really clean for you. But there was something in her eyes that didn't match her innocent tone. A flicker of something that looked almost like satisfaction. I need to open the windows and air this out, I said, but she held up a gloved hand to stop me. Actually, I just applied the treatment. It needs to sit for at least an hour to be effective. If we open the windows now, all my hard work will be wasted. Her voice had taken on that fake patient tone she used when she wanted Dad to think she was being reasonable with his unreasonable daughter. But the fumes are toxic. We need to get fresh air in here now. Diane sighed and pulled off her mask, revealing the indented lines it had left around her nose and mouth. Zoe, I appreciate your concern, but I researched this thoroughly. A little chemical smell is normal with professional-grade cleaning products. It's not toxic, it's just strong. You'll get used to it. I stared at her in disbelief. Either she was dangerously ignorant about basic chemical safety, or she knew exactly what she was doing. The way she had equipped herself with gloves and a mask while leaving me to breathe the fumes unprotected suggested it wasn't ignorance. I'm going to stay at Natalie's tonight, I announced, already reaching for my phone. Don't be dramatic, Diane said with a laugh that sounded forced. It's just cleaning products, not nerve gas. Besides, your father is making dinner tonight. He'll be disappointed if you're not here. The mention of Dad made me pause. We had been having so little quality time together lately, and I knew he had been making an effort to be home for dinner more often. But the chemical smell was making me feel nauseous and lightheaded, and every instinct I had was screaming at me to get out of the house. Maybe we could eat with the windows open, I suggested. Just until the smell clears.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Diane's expression shifted slightly, the manufactured concern giving way to something harder. You know, Zoe, I'm starting to think you just don't appreciate the effort I put into taking care of this family. I spent my entire afternoon making your room spotless, and instead of thanking me, you're complaining about the smell and trying to leave. There it was. The guilt trip that always came when I tried to assert any kind of boundary. The implication that I was ungrateful, that I was the problem, that any reasonable person would be thrilled to have such a dedicated stepmother. I do appreciate it, I said, automatically, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. I just think we should be careful with chemical fumes. If you're really that concerned, you can sleep in the guest room tonight. But honestly, I think you're overreacting. She began gathering her cleaning supplies, the spray bottle prominently displayed among them like evidence of her good intentions. I spent the evening in the guest room with a towel stuffed under the door, texting with Natalie and researching chloramine gas exposure on my phone. What I found terrified me. The gas could cause immediate respiratory distress, chemical burns to the lungs, and in extreme cases death. Even low-level exposure could cause lasting damage, especially in enclosed spaces. Dad came home around 7, and I could hear him and Diane talking in low voices downstairs. I caught fragments of the conversation through the heating vents. Diane's voice, explaining how she had deep cleaned my room as a surprise. Dad's response, something about teenage drama and sensitivity. Diane again, suggesting that maybe I was having adjustment issues and might benefit from talking to someone professional. The casual way she pathologized my reaction to being poisoned made my hands shake with rage. She had created a dangerous situation, dismissed my legitimate health concerns, and was now positioning herself as the long-suffering stepmother dealing with a troubled teenager. Around 10 o'clock, Dad knocked on the guest room door. When I opened it, he looked tired and confused, like he had been trying to solve an equation with missing variables. Hey kiddo, he said, settling onto the edge of the bed. Diane says you're upset about the cleaning she did in your room. I wanted to tell him everything. About the toxic gas, about the deliberate mixing of chemicals, about the pattern of escalating boundary violations that had been building for months. But looking at his face, I could see he had already decided on the narrative. I was being oversensitive. Diane was trying her best. This was normal stepfamily growing pains. The smell is really strong, Dad. It's making me sick. He nodded sympathetically. I know change is hard, Zoe, and I know having a stepmom isn't the same as having your mom. But Diane really cares about you. She spent her whole afternoon making your room perfect. Did she tell you she mixed bleach and ammonia? Dad frowned. She said she used some strong cleaning products. Professional grade stuff. Dad, mixing bleach and ammonia creates poison gas. It's dangerous. We learned about it in chemistry class. For a moment I saw doubt flicker across his face. But then he shook his head slightly, as if dismissing the thought. I'm sure she knew what she was doing. Diane's very careful about things like that. Maybe it just smells stronger than you're used to. The dismissal felt like a physical blow. My own father, who used to trust my judgment and listen to my concerns, was choosing to believe that I was overreacting rather than consider that his wife might have done something wrong. Can we at least open the windows in my room? Just to air it out. Of course, Dad said, patting my shoulder. That sounds like a reasonable compromise. And maybe tomorrow you and Diane can talk about the best way to handle room cleaning going forward. Communication is key in blended families. After he left, I lay in the guest bed staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of the house settling around me. Through the thin walls, I could hear Diane and Dad getting ready for bed, their voices low and intimate. I heard Diane laugh at something Dad said, the sound light and musical. To anyone listening, we sounded like a normal family with normal problems. But I couldn't shake the image of Diane standing in my room with her protective gear, surrounded by toxic fumes, looking satisfied rather than concerned. The more I thought about it, the more certain I became that this hadn't been an accident or ignorance. Someone who was genuinely trying to clean wouldn't have protected herself while leaving me to breathe poison. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to start documenting what was happening in our house. Not just the big incidents, but all of it. The subtle undermining, the boundary violations, the way Diane positioned herself as the victim whenever I tried to stand up for myself. I was 17 years old, and I was tired of being gaslit by someone who was supposed to be taking care of me. The next morning, I skipped my first period and drove to the electronics store downtown. With money I had been saving from my part-time job at the local bookstore, I bought a small wireless security camera designed to look like a phone charger. It was advertised as perfect for keeping an eye on your home while traveling, but I had a different use in mind. Installing it in my room took less than 5 minutes. I positioned it on my desk, plugged into the wall where it would look natural among my other electronic devices. The camera had motion activation and could stream directly to my phone, storing footage in the cloud. If Diane wanted to continue her campaign of psychological warfare, I was going to make sure I had evidence of every single incident. For 3 weeks, the camera captured nothing more interesting than me doing homework and sleeping. Diane seemed to have backed off from her intensive cleaning schedule, and I began to wonder if maybe Dad's conversation with her had actually made a difference. Maybe she was finally going to respect some boundaries. I should have known better. It was a Thursday night when everything escalated beyond anything I could have imagined. Dad was working late on a commercial project across town, Chloe was staying overnight at her boyfriend's apartment, and it was just Diane and me in the house. I had gone to bed early, exhausted from a chemistry test and a shift at the bookstore. I woke up around 2 in the morning with my throat burning and my lungs feeling like someone had filled them with sand. The acrid chemical smell was back, stronger than it had ever been before, and there was a visible haze in the air that made everything look fuzzy and dreamlike. My first instinct was to get out of the room, but when I tried to sit up, a wave of dizziness knocked me back onto my pillow. My chest felt tight, and every breath was a struggle. Through the haze, I could see my bedroom door was closed, and there was something blocking the gap at the bottom. A towel, maybe, or clothing. Something to keep the fumes concentrated in my room. Panic cut through the chemical fog in my brain. This wasn't an accident. Someone had intentionally trapped me in a room full of toxic gas while I slept. With enormous effort, I reached for my phone on the nightstand. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely unlock the screen, but I managed to open the security camera app. Even through my blurred vision, I could see the notification of recent activity. Motion had been detected in my room just 40 minutes ago. I pressed play on the most recent clip and watched my stepmother creep into my room at 1:20 a.m., wearing the same rubber gloves and painter's mask she had used before. In her hands was the now familiar industrial spray bottle, and I watched in horrified fascination as she systematically doused every surface in my room with the cloudy liquid. She sprayed my walls, my furniture, my bedding. She even sprayed the air above where I slept, the mist settling down onto my unconscious form. But the most chilling part was what happened next. After completing her spraying routine, Diane walked to my bedroom door and carefully placed a thick towel along the bottom gap. She tested it with her foot to make sure it was properly sealed. Then she stood there for a long moment, looking at me sleeping in my bed, surrounded by the toxic cloud she had created. Even through the camera's night vision, I could see her face clearly. There was no confusion or concern. No indication that she had made a mistake or was worried about what she had done. Instead, there was a calculating expression that made my blood run cold. She was waiting to see what would happen. Waiting to see if her homemade gas chamber would work. The realization that my stepmother was actively trying to poison me cut through the chemical fog like a knife. This wasn't psychological warfare anymore. This was attempted murder. I tried to call 911, but my vision was too blurred to see the numbers clearly. Instead, I managed to call the one person I trusted completely. Uncle Troy answered on the second ring, his voice thick with sleep. "Zoe, what's wrong?" "Uncle Troy," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I need help. Diane, she's trying to poison me. Can't breathe." Camera footage. There was a pause, then Uncle Troy's voice became sharp and alert. "Where are you?" "My room. Chemical fumes. Call police. Stay on the line. I'm calling 911 right now." The next few minutes were a blur of sirens, flashing lights, and paramedics wearing breathing equipment. Someone carried me out of the house and into an ambulance, where they put an oxygen mask over my face and started asking me questions I could barely answer. Through the ambulance windows, I could see neighbors coming out of their houses, drawn by the commotion. Diane stood on our front lawn in her bathrobe, talking to a police officer. Even from a distance, I could see her gesturing toward the ambulance, her face a perfect mask of concern and confusion. She looked like exactly what she was pretending to be. A worried stepmother whose stepdaughter was having some kind of medical emergency. But I had something she didn't know about. I had proof. At the hospital, Dr. Kim confirmed what I already knew. I had been exposed to dangerous levels of chloramine gas, and if I had stayed in that room much longer, the damage to my lungs could have been permanent or even fatal. They kept me overnight for observation, monitoring my oxygen levels and treating me for chemical exposure. Uncle Troy never left my side. He was Dad's younger brother, a software engineer who lived in downtown Portland and had always been the family member I could talk to about anything. When Dad married Diane, Uncle Troy had been politely supportive but privately skeptical. He had seen through her performance from the beginning, but like me, he hadn't fully understood how dangerous she was. "Tell me everything," he said once the doctors confirmed I was stable. From the beginning, so I did. I told him about the pattern of boundary violations, the missing items, the previous chemical incident. I showed him the security footage on my phone, and I watched his face change as he realized what we were looking at. "Jesus Christ, Zoe. She could have killed you." "I know. And if I hadn't had the camera, no one would have believed me. She would have said it was an accident, or that I was being dramatic, or that I did it to myself for attention." Uncle Troy was quiet for a long moment, studying the footage. When he looked up, his expression was grim. "We're not letting her get away with this. But we need to be smart about how we handle it. She's going to deny everything, and she's going to try to make you look unstable." He was right. Within hours, Diane's version of events was already taking shape. She told Dad that she had found me unconscious in my room, and immediately called 911. She suggested that maybe I had been experimenting with household chemicals, or that I had some kind of mental health crisis that manifested in self-harm. She was worried about me, she said. She thought maybe I needed professional help. The narrative was perfect. The troubled teenager acting out after losing her mother, the caring stepmother trying her best to help, the father caught in the middle trying to hold his family together. It was believable and sympathetic, and it positioned Diane as the victim of my instability rather than the perpetrator of attempted murder. But this time I had evidence. Detective Barnes arrived at the hospital the next morning, a serious woman in her 40s with graying hair and sharp eyes. She had been assigned to investigate what was being called a domestic incident involving chemical exposure. Uncle Troy had already spoken with her briefly, but she wanted to hear my account directly. "I understand you have some concerns about your stepmother's actions," she said, settling into the chair beside my hospital bed. "I have proof that she tried to poison me," I replied, unlocking my phone and opening the security camera app. I installed this camera in my room 3 weeks ago because she had been escalating her behavior, and I wanted documentation. Detective Barnes watched the footage without comment, her expression professionally neutral. When it finished, she asked me to play it again, this time pausing at key moments to examine details. The timestamp showing 1:20 a.m. Diane's protective gear. The methodical spraying. The towel placed to seal the room. "Have you shown this to anyone else?" "Just my uncle. And I can prove the camera was installed weeks before this happened. There's a digital trail showing when I purchased it, and when I first activated the account." Detective Barnes nodded slowly. This is very serious, Zoe. If this footage is authentic, we're looking at a potential attempted murder charge. Are you prepared for what that means? I thought about Dad, who was probably at home right now listening to Diane's version of events. I thought about our neighbors, who had seen me carried out of the house on a stretcher. I thought about the months of gaslighting and psychological manipulation that had led to this moment. I'm prepared, I said. She tried to kill me. And if I don't speak up now, she'll just try again. The investigation moved quickly once Detective Barnes saw the footage. A hazmat team was brought in to test the residual chemicals in my room, confirming dangerous levels of chloramine gas. The spray bottle Diane had used was found in the garage, still containing traces of the bleach and ammonia mixture. Her protective gear was discovered in the laundry room, still reeking of chemicals. Most damaging of all was the towel that had been used to seal my room. It was still damp with chemical residue, and forensic testing showed it had been deliberately placed to prevent air circulation. Dad was devastated when Detective Barnes showed him the evidence. I watched through the hospital room window as Uncle Troy explained what had really happened, showing him the security footage on my phone. Dad's face went through a series of expressions: disbelief, horror, guilt, and finally a rage I had never seen before. When he came to see me that evening, he looked like he had aged 10 years in a single day. "Zoe," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry. I should have listened to you. I should have seen what was happening." "You saw what she wanted you to see," I replied. "She's very good at manipulation. That's what made her so dangerous." Dad sat down heavily in the chair beside my bed. "I keep thinking about all the times you tried to tell me something was wrong, and I dismissed it as adjustment issues. She could have killed you, and I was making excuses for her." "Where is she now?" "In jail. They arrested her this morning. The DA is considering charges for attempted murder, child endangerment, and assault with a deadly weapon." He paused, struggling with the words. How did I marry someone who would do this to my daughter? It was a question that would haunt our family for months to come. How do you miss the signs when someone is that skilled at hiding their true nature? How do you rebuild trust after something like this? But in that hospital room, with the oxygen mask beside my bed and the security footage as evidence, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 2 years. I felt heard. I felt believed. I felt like my father was truly seeing me again for the first time since Diane had entered our lives. The legal proceedings would take months to resolve, and there would be therapy and healing and difficult conversations ahead. But for the first time since this nightmare began, I knew that justice was possible. I knew that documentation and evidence could overcome even the most skilled manipulation. And I knew that I would never again allow someone to make me question my own reality, no matter how convincing their performance might be. Sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who smile while they hurt you, who position themselves as the victim while they destroy your life. But the truth has a way of surfacing eventually, especially when you have the courage to document it and the determination to fight back. That security camera didn't just capture evidence of a crime, it captured proof that I wasn't crazy, wasn't overreacting, wasn't the problem. Sometimes when everyone around you is telling you that your reality isn't real, the most powerful thing you can do is simply record the truth and wait for the right moment to reveal it. The footage that almost became evidence of my murder instead became the key to my freedom. The courthouse smelled like old wood and disinfectant, a sterile attempt to mask decades of human drama that had played out within its walls. I sat in the front row of the gallery, my hands folded in my lap, watching as people filed into the courtroom for what the local news had dubbed the poison stepmother trial. The media attention had been relentless, turning our family tragedy into a sensationalized story that cable news programs dissected nightly. Diane entered through a side door, flanked by 2 bailiffs and her attorney, a sharp-dressed woman named Miss Garrett who specialized in defending the indefensible. Diane had lost weight during her 3 months in jail, awaiting trial, and her once perfect blonde hair hung limp around her shoulders. She wore a conservative navy dress and minimal makeup, clearly styled to appear sympathetic and non-threatening. When she glanced in my direction, her eyes held none of the calculated coldness I remembered. Instead, she looked like a frightened woman who couldn't understand how her life had spiraled so completely out of control. The transformation was so complete that for a moment I almost doubted my own memories. This pale, diminished woman bore little resemblance to the predator who had stalked through my room at night, methodically creating a gas chamber while I slept. But then I remembered the security footage, the satisfied expression on her face as she sealed my door, and my resolve hardened. District Attorney Williams had prepared me for this moment. Diane's defense strategy was predictable, he had explained. They would paint her as a well-meaning stepmother, who made a tragic mistake, a victim of ignorance rather than malice. They would suggest that I was an unstable teenager, who had deliberately created the dangerous chemical mixture myself, then planted evidence to frame her. They would question the authenticity of the security footage, argue that it had been manipulated, or staged. The truth is on our side, Diane Williams had assured me during our final preparation meeting. But we need to be ready for them to attack your credibility. They're going to try to make you look like a disturbed child, who fantasized about being victimized. Jury selection had taken 2 days, and I had watched from the gallery as potential jurors were questioned about their ability to remain impartial in a case involving domestic violence and attempted murder. Several had been dismissed when they admitted they couldn't imagine a stepmother deliberately trying to harm her husband's child. Others were eliminated when they revealed they had strong opinions about blended families or teenage behavior. The final jury consisted of 8 women and 4 men, ranging in age from their 20s to their 60s. Judge Martinez called the court to order, and D.A. Williams rose to deliver his opening statement. He was a tall, imposing man with silver hair and a voice that commanded attention. As he began to speak, outlining the state's case against Diane Fletcher, I felt a mixture of vindication and terror. This was really happening. After months of preparation, investigation, and legal maneuvering, we were finally going to have our day in court. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, D.A. Williams began. Over the next several days, you will hear evidence of a calculated attempt to murder a 17-year-old girl. Not in a moment of passion, not as the result of a mental breakdown, but as the culmination of a systematic campaign of psychological abuse that escalated to attempted homicide. He paused, letting the words sink in before continuing. The defendant, Diane Fletcher, married the victim's father 2 years ago. From the beginning, she viewed Zoe Harper not as a daughter to nurture, but as an obstacle to eliminate. When subtle psychological manipulation wasn't enough to drive Zoe from the home, the defendant escalated to more direct methods. On the night of October 15th, she entered Zoe's bedroom, while the teenager slept, and filled the room with a toxic gas created by mixing industrial-strength bleach and ammonia. She then sealed the room to prevent the gas from escaping, creating what can only be described as a homemade gas chamber. Several jurors visibly reacted to this description, and I saw one woman in the back row shake her head in apparent disbelief. D.A. Williams continued methodically, explaining how the security footage would prove premeditation, how the medical evidence would demonstrate the severity of my injuries, and how the physical evidence would confirm that this was no accident. When he finished, Ms. Garrett rose for the defense's opening statement. She was younger than D.A. Williams, probably in her 40s, with auburn hair and an understated elegance that suggested competence without aggression. Her approach was immediately different, her voice warm and sympathetic as she addressed the jury. "What you've just heard sounds horrifying," she acknowledged. "And if it were true, it would indeed be a terrible crime. But ladies and gentlemen, the reality is far more complex and far more tragic than the prosecution would have you believe. Diane Fletcher is not a monster. She is a woman who made a mistake. A woman who has been demonized by a troubled teenager desperate for attention and sympathy." Miss Garrett walked closer to the jury box, her expression earnest and concerned. "Zoe Harper lost her mother at a young age, and she has struggled to accept her father's remarriage. This is not uncommon in blended families. What is uncommon is the lengths to which she has gone to discredit her stepmother. The so-called security footage you will see was created by Zoe herself, staged to support a false narrative of abuse that exists only in her imagination." I felt my stomach clench as she continued, painting me as a master manipulator who had orchestrated an elaborate deception. According to Miss Garrett, I had mixed the chemicals myself, filmed fake footage using a friend as a stand-in for Diane, and then called for help to make myself appear to be the victim. It was a desperate attempt to get rid of an unwanted stepmother, she claimed, that had spiraled out of control when I miscalculated the danger of the chemicals involved. By the end of this trial, Miss Garrett concluded, you will see that the real victim here is not Zoe Harper, but Diane Fletcher, a woman whose only crime was trying to love a child who was determined to hate her. The opening statements set the tone for what would become a contentious and emotionally draining trial. Over the next 3 days, D.A. Williams methodically presented the state's case, calling witness after witness to establish the timeline of events and the physical evidence. Dr. Kim testified about my condition when I arrived at the hospital, describing the chemical burns in my lungs and the dangerously low oxygen levels in my blood. In my professional opinion, she stated, if Miss Harper had remained in that environment for another hour, she would likely have suffered permanent respiratory damage or death. The forensic chemist who had analyzed the residue in my room explained how the combination of bleach and ammonia created chloramine gas, a substance so toxic it had been used as a chemical weapon during World War I. He described the concentrations found in my bedroom, confirming that they were lethal levels that could only have been achieved through deliberate mixing and application. Detective Barnes walked the jury through the physical evidence, displaying photographs of the spray bottle found in our garage, the towel used to seal my door, and the protective equipment discovered in Diane's possession. Each item was carefully catalogued and explained, building a comprehensive picture of premeditation and intent. But the most powerful evidence was the security footage itself. When DA Williams played the video on the courtroom's large screen, the room fell completely silent. Even knowing what was coming, watching Diane creep into my room and systematically spray toxic chemicals while I slept, was chilling. The footage was clear and damning, showing not just the action but the deliberate nature of it. There was no confusion or accident visible in Diane's movements. She worked methodically and efficiently, like someone following a well-planned procedure. The defense's cross-examination of each witness was aggressive but ultimately unsuccessful in creating reasonable doubt. Ms. Garrett suggested that the chemicals could have been mixed accidentally, that the protective equipment was standard safety gear any responsible person would use when cleaning, and that the footage had been manipulated. But when the prosecution presented metadata confirming the video's authenticity, and called technical experts to verify that no editing had occurred, these arguments fell flat. On the fourth day of the trial, it was my turn to testify. I had been dreading this moment since the proceedings began, knowing that Miss Garrett would do everything possible to discredit me and paint me as an unstable, manipulative teenager. DA Williams had prepared me extensively, but no amount of preparation could completely ease the anxiety of facing my stepmother's attorney in open court. I walked to the witness stand wearing a simple gray dress that Uncle Troy had helped me choose, something that looked mature but not overly formal. As I was sworn in, I could feel the weight of everyone's attention, from the jury to the packed gallery to the reporters scribbling notes in the back row. But most intensely, I felt Diane's gaze, studying me with an expression I couldn't quite read. DA Williams began with basic questions about my background, my relationship with my father, and my mother's death 3 years earlier. He asked me to describe life before Diane entered our family, establishing a baseline of normalcy and happiness that would contrast with what came later. Then carefully and methodically, he guided me through the escalating pattern of psychological abuse. Can you describe the first incident that made you concerned about your stepmother's behavior? I took a breath, organizing my thoughts. About 6 months after the wedding, I came home from school to find that she had cleaned my room. When I asked her about it, she said she was just being helpful, but several things were missing. A bracelet my mom gave me, some photos, a journal I kept. When I asked about them, she said she hadn't seen them, and suggested that maybe I had lost them myself. How did that make you feel? Confused and frustrated. I knew where I had left those things, but she was so convincing when she denied moving them, that I started to doubt myself. And when I tried to talk to my dad about it, she was there too, acting concerned and helpful. It made me look like I was being unreasonable. DA Williams walked me through incident after incident, each one escalating in severity. The cropped family photos, the donation of my mother's jewelry box, the increasingly frequent deep cleaning sessions that always resulted in damaged or missing items. With each example, a clear pattern emerged of psychological manipulation designed to make me question my own memory and sanity. Let's talk about the first chemical incident, DA Williams said. Can you describe what happened? I explained how I had come home to find my room filled with toxic fumes, how Diane had claimed ignorance about the dangers of mixing bleach and ammonia, and how she had insisted the room needed to remain sealed for the chemicals to be effective. As I spoke, I could see several jurors taking notes, their expressions growing more serious. What made you decide to install a security camera in your room? I was tired of feeling crazy, I said honestly. Every time something happened, Diane would have an explanation that made me look like the problem. My dad would side with her because her version always sounded more reasonable. I knew that if I wanted anyone to believe me, I needed proof. DA Williams then played the security footage again, asking me to narrate what we were seeing. Watching it in the courtroom, with the jury's horrified faces visible in my peripheral vision, made the reality of what had happened feel even more stark. This woman had tried to kill me, and without the camera she would have succeeded in making everyone believe it was my own fault. When you woke up that night, what did you think was happening? At first I thought maybe I was having a nightmare. The smell was so strong, and the room was so hazy, that it felt surreal. But when I tried to sit up and couldn't breathe properly, I realized something was really wrong. Then I saw that my door was sealed, and I knew this wasn't an accident. What went through your mind when you realized what was happening? I paused, remembering the terror and disbelief of that moment. I couldn't believe that someone who was supposed to be taking care of me was actually trying to kill me. Even with everything that had happened before, I never imagined she would go that far. The cross-examination was brutal. Miss Garrett attacked every aspect of my testimony, suggesting that I was a troubled teenager with a history of behavioral problems and attention-seeking behavior. She implied that I had researched chemical weapons online, that I had planned the entire scenario to frame Diane, and that my emotional reactions were calculated performances rather than genuine trauma. Isn't it true, Miss Harper, that you resented your stepmother from the moment she married your father? I was cautious about her, I admitted. Any kid would be nervous about a new stepparent. But I wanted the marriage to work. I wanted my dad to be happy. But you never really gave her a chance, did you? You were determined to see her as the enemy, rather than accept her as part of your family. That's not true. I tried to build a relationship with her, but she made it clear that I wasn't wanted. Garrett produced a series of text messages between Diane and my father, exchanges where she expressed frustration about my behavior, and suggested that I might need professional help. Reading them in court, they sounded like the concerns of a caring stepmother dealing with a difficult teenager, rather than the manipulations of an abuser. These messages show that Mrs. Fletcher was genuinely worried about your welfare, doesn't it? They show that she was building a narrative, I replied. She was setting up the story that I was unstable, so that if I ever tried to report her behavior, no one would believe me. Or maybe they show that you actually were exhibiting concerning behavior, and she was trying to help you. The questioning continued for hours, with Miss Garrett systematically attempting to dismantle my credibility. She suggested that I had the technical knowledge to edit the security footage, that I had opportunity to plant the physical evidence, and that my entire story was an elaborate fiction designed to destroy an innocent woman's life. By the time I was dismissed from the witness stand, I was exhausted and emotionally drained. But I felt like I had told my truth clearly and honestly, and that the jury had heard me. DA Williams squeezed my shoulder as I returned to my seat, a small gesture of support that meant everything in that moment. The trial's final phase involved expert testimony about the security footage and psychological profiles of both Diane and myself. The prosecution's computer forensics expert confirmed that the video was authentic and unedited, providing technical details about metadata and compression that left no room for doubt about its legitimacy. A forensic psychologist testified about patterns of abuse in blended families, explaining how psychological manipulation could escalate to physical violence when the abuser felt their control was threatened. The defense countered with their own experts, including a psychologist who suggested that I exhibited signs of oppositional defiant disorder, and might have fabricated the abuse allegations as a way of rejecting my father's new marriage. But their testimony felt forced and unconvincing, especially in light of the overwhelming physical evidence. Diane herself never took the stand. Miss Garrett had clearly decided that her client's testimony would only hurt their case, particularly given the damning security footage that directly contradicted any innocent explanation for her actions. Closing arguments took place on a gray Friday afternoon, with rain pattering against the courthouse windows. DA Williams methodically reviewed the evidence, emphasizing the premeditation visible in the security footage and the lethal nature of the chemicals involved. He reminded the jury that this wasn't a case about teenage rebellion or blended family difficulties, but about attempted murder. The defendant tried to kill a 17-year-old girl, he stated simply. The evidence is clear, the intent is obvious, and the only reason we're here today, instead of attending a funeral, is because Zoe Harper had the foresight to document what was happening to her. Miss Garrett's closing argument was passionate, but ultimately hollow. She painted Diane as a victim of false accusations, a woman whose only crime was trying to create a stable home environment for a troubled teenager. But the security footage made her arguments feel desperate and unconvincing. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning with their verdict. As they filed back into the courtroom, their faces were grim and determined. Judge Martinez asked the foreperson to stand, and I held my breath as she announced their decision. On the charge of attempted murder in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. The words seemed to echo in the suddenly silent courtroom. Diane's shoulders sagged as if she had been physically struck, and Miss Garrett put a comforting hand on her client's arm. In the gallery I could hear someone crying softly, though I couldn't tell if it was from relief or grief. On the charge of child endangerment, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of assault with a deadly weapon, we find the defendant guilty. Judge Martinez thanked the jury for their service and scheduled sentencing for the following month. As the bailiffs led Diane away, she turned to look at me one last time. Her expression held no anger or hatred, just a profound sadness that seemed to encompass everything we had lost as a family. Outside the courthouse, D.A. Williams held a brief press conference while Uncle Troy and I waited in his car. The media attention had been overwhelming throughout the trial, with reporters and camera crews documenting every development. Uncle Troy had shielded me from most of it, but I knew that our story had become national news, another sensational case that would be analyzed and debated on talk shows and social media. "How do you feel?" Uncle Troy asked as we drove away from the courthouse. "Empty," I said honestly. "I thought I'd feel victorious or relieved, but mostly I just feel tired." "That's normal," he assured me. "Justice doesn't always feel the way we think it will. Sometimes it just feels like the end of something painful." Sentencing took place 4 weeks later. Judge Martinez gave Diane 15 years to life in prison, citing the premeditated nature of the crime and the vulnerability of the victim. She would be eligible for parole after serving at least 12 years, but given the severity of the charges, it was unlikely she would be released anytime soon. Dad attended the sentencing hearing, sitting in the back row of the gallery with his head down. He had aged visibly during the trial, the stress and guilt etched deep lines around his eyes. Our relationship was slowly healing, but it would take time to rebuild the trust that had been damaged by his initial refusal to believe me. After the sentencing, Dad and I met for coffee at a small cafe near the courthouse. It was the first time we had been alone together since before the trial began, and the conversation was awkward at first. "I keep thinking about all the signs I missed," he said, stirring his coffee without drinking it. "All the times you tried to tell me something was wrong, and I dismissed it as teenage drama." "She was very convincing," I replied. "That's what made her dangerous. She knew exactly how to present herself as the reasonable one while making me look like the problem. But I should have listened to you. You're my daughter. I should have trusted your instincts over hers." We sat in silence for a while, watching the rain streak down the cafe windows. Finally, Dad spoke again. "I don't know how to make this right. I don't know how to fix what happened to our family." "We can't fix it," I said. "We can only move forward and try to do better." 6 months after the trial ended, I graduated from Lincoln High School as valedictorian. The speech I gave at graduation focused on resilience and the importance of standing up for yourself when no one else will. I didn't mention the trial or Diane by name, but everyone in the audience knew what I was talking about. Uncle Troy had become my legal guardian after Dad decided he needed time to address his own trauma and guilt through therapy. Living with Uncle Troy was peaceful in a way I had almost forgotten was possible. There were no mind games, no walking on eggshells, no questioning my own reality. Just normal family life, with someone who genuinely cared about my well-being. I enrolled at Portland State University that fall, majoring in psychology with a focus on trauma and family systems. My experience with Diane had given me insight into how abuse operates within families, and I wanted to use that knowledge to help other victims who might be struggling to be believed. The security camera that had saved my life became the centerpiece of a victim advocacy presentation I gave to local law enforcement agencies. I explained how documentation could be crucial in cases where the abuser was skilled at manipulation, and how technology could level the playing field for victims who felt powerless. The most dangerous thing about psychological abuse, I told a room full of police officers and social workers, is how it makes you doubt your own reality. When someone consistently tells you that your perceptions are wrong, that your memories are faulty, that your reactions are inappropriate, you start to believe them. Having concrete evidence breaks through that gaslighting and provides an anchor to the truth. The presentation was well received, and I began getting requests to speak at other conferences and training sessions. My story had become a case study in how careful documentation could overcome even sophisticated manipulation tactics. 2 years after the trial, I received a letter from Diane in prison. She had been undergoing psychological treatment and had been diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder and antisocial traits. The letter was an attempt at an apology, though it was clear she still didn't fully understand the magnitude of what she had done. She wrote about her childhood, about feeling invisible and unwanted, about how she had learned to manipulate others as a survival mechanism. She claimed that she had never intended to seriously harm me, that the chemical incident was meant to make me sick enough to be sent away rather than to kill me. It was a distinction that felt meaningless, given the lethal nature of what she had done. I read the letter once and then threw it away. I had no interest in understanding her motivations or accepting her apology. Some actions are unforgivable, and attempted murder falls into that category, regardless of the perpetrator's psychological damage. Dad and I had rebuilt our relationship slowly and carefully. He was in therapy working through his guilt and learning to recognize manipulation tactics. We had dinner together every week, and while our relationship would never be exactly what it was before Diane, it was honest now in a way it hadn't been during those 2 years of gaslighting. "I almost lost you twice," he told me during one of our dinners. "Once to her poison, and once to my own blindness. I'm grateful every day that you were strong enough to fight back." "I wasn't strong," I replied. "I was desperate. When someone is trying to erase your reality, you have to find a way to prove that you exist." On the 3rd anniversary of the night Diane tried to kill me, I visited the cemetery where my mother was buried. I brought flowers and sat by her headstone, telling her about my life and my plans for the future. I talked about college, about my advocacy work, about how I had learned to trust my own perceptions again. "I think you would be proud of how I handled it," I said to the granite marker. "I didn't let her win. I didn't let her make me disappear." As I walked back to my car, I thought about the security camera that had changed everything. Such a small device, no bigger than a phone charger, but it had literally saved my life. It had given me proof when everyone else wanted to dismiss my reality. It had provided evidence when my word alone wasn't enough. The lesson I had learned was both simple and profound. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply document the truth and wait for the right moment to reveal it. In a world where manipulation and gaslighting are common tactics, evidence becomes a form of self-defense. I kept the camera, even though I no longer needed it for protection. It sat on my desk in my dorm room, a reminder that I had the strength to fight back when someone tried to destroy me. It was proof that even when you're young and powerless, even when the adults around you refuse to believe you, you can still find a way to make the truth visible. Sometimes justice comes slowly, and sometimes it comes at great personal cost. But when you have evidence of the truth, when you have documentation of reality, the manipulators and gaslighters eventually run out of places to hide. The camera had given me something more valuable than proof of Diane's guilt. It had given me proof of my own sanity, my own worth, my own right to exist safely in the world. That was a gift I would carry with me for the rest of my life. The notification arrived on a Tuesday morning, while I was reviewing case files for my internship at the Portland Family Justice Center.
5 years had passed since the trial, and I was now in my final semester of graduate school, completing my master's degree in clinical psychology, with a specialization in trauma-informed care. The email was from the Oregon Department of Corrections, marked with the official seal that I had learned to recognize over the years. Inmate 47291 Fletcher, Diane has been granted a parole hearing scheduled for March 15th. As a registered victim in this case, you have the right to submit a victim impact statement and appear at the hearing if you choose to do so. I stared at the screen for a long moment, feeling my carefully constructed sense of security begin to crack around the edges. Diane had served 8 years of her 15-year sentence, and while I had always known this day might come, I hadn't expected it to arrive so soon. 8 years felt like both a lifetime and no time at all, depending on which lens I used to examine it. My supervisor, Dr. Chen, noticed the change in my demeanor immediately when I walked into our weekly supervision meeting that afternoon. She was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and an uncanny ability to read the emotional states of everyone around her, skills that had made her one of the most respected trauma therapists in the Pacific Northwest. "Something's shifted for you today," she observed as I settled into the chair across from her desk. "You look like someone who just received unexpected news." I handed her the printed email, watching her face carefully as she read it.
Dr. Chen knew my history, of course. It was impossible to work in trauma therapy without addressing your own experiences, and she had been instrumental in helping me process the complex emotions that came with turning personal trauma into professional purpose. "How are you feeling about this?" she asked, setting the paper aside and giving me her full attention. "Honestly, terrified. And angry that I'm terrified." I rubbed my temples, trying to organize the whirlwind of emotions that had been building since morning. I thought I had moved past this. I thought I was stronger now. "Strength isn't the absence of fear," Dr. Chen reminded me gently. "It's what you do with the fear when it arrives. You've built an entire career around helping other trauma survivors reclaim their power. That doesn't mean you're immune to being triggered by reminders of your own experience." We spent the next hour exploring my options. I could submit a written statement opposing parole without attending the hearing. I could attend and speak in person. Or I could choose not to participate at all, trusting that the parole board would make their decision based on the existing evidence and Diane's behavior during incarceration. "What feels right to you?" Dr. Chen asked as our session neared its end. "I don't know yet. Part of me wants to face her again, to show her that I survived and thrived despite what she did. But another part of me wants to preserve the peace I've built by staying as far away from her as possible." That evening, I called Uncle Troy from my apartment near the university. He was in his kitchen making dinner, and I could hear the familiar sounds of chopping and sautéing in the background. Our relationship had only grown stronger over the years, and he remained my closest confidant and biggest supporter. "I was wondering when we'd get that call," he said after I read him the email. "Have you talked to your dad about it?" Dad and I spoke regularly now, our relationship having healed considerably through years of family therapy and honest communication. He had remarried 2 years ago to a kind woman named Susan who worked as a librarian and treated me with genuine warmth rather than competitive hostility. It was a stark contrast to his relationship with Diane, and it had helped me understand what a healthy blended family could actually look like. Not yet. I wanted to process it myself first before involving anyone else. That's wise. What are you leaning toward? I stirred the pasta I was making for dinner, considering the question. I think I need to be there. Not for her, but for me. And maybe for other victims who don't have the resources or support to speak for themselves. Uncle Troy was quiet for a moment. "You know I'll support whatever decision you make. But I want you to be sure you're doing this for the right reasons. Don't put yourself through additional trauma just to prove a point." Over the next week, I researched everything I could about Diane's time in prison. Through victim notification services and public records, I learned that she had been a model prisoner for the most part. She had completed her GED, participated in various rehabilitation programs, and had only one disciplinary incident early in her sentence when she was caught attempting to manipulate other inmates into conflicts with guards. More concerning was the information I gathered about her psychological evaluations. While she had been diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder and antisocial traits, the prison psychologist noted that she had become skilled at presenting herself as reformed and rehabilitated. She participated enthusiastically in therapy sessions and group discussions, but there were notes questioning the genuineness of her engagement. "Subject demonstrates sophisticated understanding of therapeutic language and concepts," one evaluation read. "However, responses often feel rehearsed rather than authentic. Recommend continued monitoring for potential manipulation of treatment processes." It was exactly what I had expected. Diane's greatest skill had always been her ability to present herself as whatever people wanted to see. In our home, she had been the perfect stepmother when Dad was around. During the trial, she had transformed into a victim of false accusations. Now in prison, she had apparently become the ideal candidate for rehabilitation. I decided to attend the hearing and speak in person. But first I wanted to understand exactly what I would be walking into. I reached out to Maria Santos, a victim advocate who specialized in parole proceedings. We met for coffee at a quiet cafe near downtown Portland, and she walked me through what to expect. Parole hearings can be re-traumatizing for victims. Maria explained, her voice gentle but direct. You'll be in the same room as your perpetrator, often for the first time since the trial. She'll have the opportunity to speak on her own behalf, and you might hear her minimize what she did or claim to be a changed person. What kind of questions will they ask me? They'll want to know how the crime affected your life, whether you believe she poses a continued threat, and what you think about the possibility of her release. The board takes victim impact seriously, but ultimately their decision will be based on multiple factors including her behavior in prison, her participation in programs, and whether they believe she's genuinely rehabilitated. Maria also warned me about something I hadn't considered, the possibility that Diane might try to approach me directly, either before or after the hearing. It's not uncommon for perpetrators to attempt contact with their victims during the parole process. They might want to apologize, justify their actions, or try to manipulate the victim into supporting their release. The thought of Diane approaching me sent a chill down my spine. Even after all these years, even with all the therapy and personal growth, the idea of being in the same room with her felt overwhelming. But I reminded myself that I was no longer the frightened 17-year-old who had nearly died in her bedroom. I was now a graduate student with extensive training in psychology, a victim advocate with years of experience, and most importantly, a survivor who had transformed her trauma into purpose. I spent the following weeks preparing my victim impact statement with the help of Dr. Chen and Maria. We crafted a document that was powerful but measured, focusing on the long-term effects of Diane's actions rather than simply recounting the details of the crime. I wrote about the years of therapy needed to overcome the psychological damage, about the way her gaslighting had affected my ability to trust my own perceptions, and about the ongoing hypervigilance that colored my daily life. But I also wrote about my recovery and growth. I described my academic achievements, my work with other trauma survivors, and the healthy relationships I had built. I wanted the parole board to understand that while Diane had caused significant harm, she had not succeeded in destroying me. The goal is to show them both the depth of the impact and the strength of your recovery, Dr. Chen explained, as we reviewed the final draft. You want them to see you as a whole person who has reclaimed her power, not just as a victim frozen in time. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning at the Oregon State Correctional Institution in Salem. Uncle Troy offered to drive me, and Dad asked if he could attend as well. Having their support felt crucial, especially since I knew that Diane would likely have her own supporters present. Prison records showed that she had maintained correspondence with several people from her past, including a former colleague who had agreed to provide a character reference for the hearing. The night before the hearing, I could barely sleep. I found myself checking and rechecking the locks on my apartment door, a behavior that usually only emerged during periods of high stress. I called my therapist's emergency line around midnight, needing to talk through the anxiety that was threatening to overwhelm my carefully maintained composure. It's normal to feel this activated before facing your perpetrator again, Dr. Martinez assured me. Your nervous system is remembering the threat, even though your rational mind knows you're safe now. Try some of the grounding techniques we've practiced, and remember that you have the power to leave at any time if you need to. The drive to Salem took about an hour through gray Oregon countryside dotted with bare trees and dormant farmland. Uncle Troy kept the conversation light, telling me about his latest software project, and asking about my thesis research. Dad was quieter, probably processing his own complex emotions about seeing the woman who had nearly killed his daughter and destroyed his family. The correctional facility was a sprawling complex of gray concrete buildings surrounded by high fences topped with razor wire. The parking lot was nearly empty except for official vehicles and a few cars belonging to other hearing attendees. As we walked toward the main entrance, I felt my heart rate increase, and my palms begin to sweat. The waiting area was sterile and institutional, with fluorescent lighting and uncomfortable plastic chairs arranged in rigid rows. A few other people were already there, including a middle-aged woman who looked nervous and a man in a suit who was probably someone's attorney. Maria met us there, providing last-minute reminders about the process and offering reassurance. When they called my name, I followed a corrections officer down a long hallway lined with small conference rooms. The hearing room was larger than I had expected, with a long table where 3 parole board members sat reviewing files. There were several rows of chairs for observers, and at one end of the room, a smaller table where Diane would sit with her attorney. I took my seat in the front row between Uncle Troy and Dad, trying to focus on my breathing and stay grounded in the present moment. The parole board members introduced themselves and explained the process. Then the door opened, and Diane entered the room. The years in prison had changed her significantly. Her once perfect blonde hair was now gray and pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore the standard-issue clothing that all inmates wore to hearings, a white button-down shirt and navy pants that did nothing to flatter her diminished figure. But what struck me most was how small she looked. The woman who had once loomed so large in my life, who had controlled and terrorized me with such sophistication, now appeared diminished and ordinary. She glanced in my direction once as she sat down, her expression carefully neutral. There was no recognition in her eyes, no acknowledgement of our shared history. It was as if she was looking at a stranger, and perhaps in her mind, that's exactly what I was. The hearing began with the parole board reviewing Diane's criminal history and her behavior during incarceration. They noted her completion of various programs, her clean disciplinary record after the early incident, and the psychological evaluations that had been conducted over the years. Then they asked her to address the board about her crime and her rehabilitation. Diane stood and cleared her throat, consulting notes written on an index card. When she spoke, her voice was steady and measured, with none of the emotional manipulation I remembered from our years living together. I take full responsibility for my actions on the night of October 15th, she began. I made a series of terrible decisions that put an innocent young woman in danger, and I understand the severity of what I did. I have spent the last 8 years examining my behavior, participating in therapy, and working to understand how I became capable of such actions. She went on to describe her participation in various rehabilitation programs, her work in the prison library, and her plans for reintegration if granted parole. She had lined up a job with a cleaning service, had arranged to live in a halfway house, and had committed to continuing therapy as an outpatient. I know that I can never undo the harm I caused, she concluded. But I believe I have become a different person through this process, someone who understands the value of human life and the importance of treating others with respect and kindness. It was a perfect performance, delivered with just the right amount of remorse and hope. But listening to her speak, I was struck by how rehearsed it sounded, how carefully crafted every word was. Even her body language seemed calculated, designed to project humility and rehabilitation. When it was my turn to speak, I stood and walked to the podium at the front of the room. I could feel Diane's eyes on me, but I kept my focus on the parole board members. My hands shook slightly as I unfolded my prepared statement, but my voice was strong and clear when I began to speak. 8 years ago, Diane Fletcher tried to murder me in my sleep by filling my bedroom with toxic gas. I was 17 years old, and she was supposed to be protecting me as my stepmother. Instead, she saw me as an obstacle to be eliminated. I went on to describe the psychological torture that had preceded the attempted murder, the way she had systematically undermined my relationship with my phone, and made me question my own sanity. I talked about the long-term effects of her actions, the years of therapy needed to recover, and the ongoing impact on my ability to trust and feel safe. But I also want the board to understand, Diane Fletcher is extraordinarily skilled at manipulation. During the 2 years she lived in our home, she convinced my father and everyone around us that she was a loving stepmother, and I was a troubled teenager. During her trial, she nearly convinced a jury that I had fabricated evidence against her. And today she has spent 8 years convincing prison staff that she is rehabilitated. I paused, making eye contact with each board member in turn. The truth is that people with her psychological profile rarely change in any meaningful way. They simply become better at hiding their true nature. Releasing her would not only put future victims at risk, but it would send a message that attempted murder of a child is a crime that can be overcome with good behavior and therapy participation. When I finished speaking, the room was silent except for the scratching of pens as the board members took notes. I returned to my seat, feeling drained, but satisfied that I had said what needed to be said. The board asked Diane a few follow-up questions about her understanding of her crime and her plans for the future. Her answers continued to be polished and appropriate, demonstrating what appeared to be genuine insight into her actions. But I noticed small things that the board might have missed, the way her eyes hardened when she thought no one was looking, the subtle shift in her posture when discussing her victims, the practiced quality of her emotional expressions. After about 2 hours, the hearing concluded with the board announcing that they would deliberate and issue their decision within 30 days. As people began to file out of the room, I gathered my things quickly, eager to leave before any awkward encounters could occur. But as we reached the hallway, I heard my name called from behind. I turned to see Diane's attorney, a woman about my age with short brown hair and a professional demeanor. "Miss Harper, I'm Jennifer Walsh, Mrs. Fletcher's attorney. I was wondering if I could speak with you for just a moment." Uncle Troy immediately stepped closer to me, his protective instincts activated. "What about?" My client asked me to convey her apologies to Miss Harper. She understands that she caused tremendous harm, and she wants you to know that she thinks about that every day. I studied the attorney's face, trying to determine if this was genuine remorse or another manipulation attempt. Did she also mention that she wrote me a letter 2 years ago, making the same apologies, and that she claimed her actions were meant to make me sick, not to kill me? Walsh looked uncomfortable. She's asked me to let you know that her understanding of her actions has evolved through continued therapy. She realizes now that there's no excuse for what she did, regardless of her intentions. Her intentions were to murder me, I said flatly. And if she's truly changed, she would understand that I have no obligation to accept her apologies or provide her with absolution. The best thing she can do for me is stay in prison where she can't hurt anyone else. The attorney nodded awkwardly and walked away, leaving us standing in the sterile hallway. As we made our way back to the parking lot, I felt a strange mixture of emotions. I was proud of myself for facing Diane again and speaking my truth to the parole board. But I was also deeply disturbed by how convincing her performance had been, how easily she might fool people who didn't understand the sophisticated nature of her manipulation. The drive back to Portland was quiet, each of us processing what we had witnessed. Finally, Dad broke the silence. She sounded very convincing in there. If I didn't know better, I might have believed she was genuinely remorseful. That's exactly the problem.
Whoa.
I replied. She's had 8 years to perfect her rehabilitation narrative, but the person I saw in that room was the same person who smiled while she tried to kill me. She's just gotten better at hiding it. Uncle Troy nodded in agreement. The way she delivered that through her attorney felt calculated. If she were truly sorry, she would respect your boundaries, instead of trying to manipulate you into forgiving her. 2 weeks later, I received another email from the Department of Corrections. The parole board had denied Diane's request for early release, citing concerns about her psychological profile and the severity of her crime. She would be eligible to apply again in 2 years, but given the board's detailed explanation of their decision, it seemed unlikely that she would be successful in future attempts. Reading the denial letter, I felt a profound sense of relief mixed with exhaustion. The process had taken more out of me emotionally than I had expected, but it had also provided a kind of closure. I had faced my abuser again, and survived. I had spoken my truth and been heard. Most importantly, I had protected future potential victims by ensuring that Diane remained where she could do no more harm. Dr. Chen and I spent several sessions processing the experience and its aftermath. She helped me understand that my strong reaction to seeing Diane again was normal and didn't represent a failure in my healing process. Trauma recovery isn't linear, she reminded me. Sometimes we need to revisit difficult experiences from a position of strength to fully integrate them into our narrative.
You went into that hearing as a powerful advocate for yourself and others, not as a helpless victim. That's a significant achievement. I returned to my work at the Family Justice Center with renewed purpose and a deeper understanding of the parole process for victims of violent crime. I began developing educational materials to help other survivors prepare for similar hearings, drawing on my own experience to create resources that addressed both the practical and emotional challenges involved. 6 months after the hearing, I defended my master's thesis on the long-term effects of psychological abuse in adolescent victims. My research had been deeply influenced by my own experience, but it also incorporated interviews with dozens of other survivors and extensive review of existing literature. The committee praised the work as both academically rigorous and practically valuable for clinicians working with trauma survivors. At the graduation ceremony, as I walked across the stage to receive my degree, I thought about the 17-year-old girl who had nearly died in her bedroom 8 years earlier. She could never have imagined that her trauma would eventually become the foundation for a career dedicated to helping others heal from similar experiences. Uncle Troy and Dad were both in the audience, beaming with pride as I accepted my diploma. Susan had driven up from Eugene to attend, bringing flowers and taking dozens of photos. Even Dr. Chen was there, having been invited to speak at the graduation ceremony about the importance of trauma-informed care in clinical practice. After the ceremony, we went to dinner at a restaurant overlooking the Willamette River. As we sat around the table sharing stories and making toasts, I felt overwhelmed with gratitude for the family I had chosen and who had chosen me. These people had supported me through the darkest period of my life and celebrated my transformation into someone who could use her pain to help others. "I'm proud of the woman you've become," Dad said, raising his glass. "Not because of what you survived, but because of what you've done with your survival."
Looking around the table at these faces full of love and support, I realized that Diane's greatest failure wasn't just that she had failed to kill me. She had failed to understand that destroying a person requires more than physical harm. It requires isolating them from love, from purpose, from the belief that their life has meaning. She had never been able to take those things from me, even during the darkest moments of her campaign against me. And now, surrounded by people who valued my existence, and celebrating an achievement that transformed my trauma into a tool for healing others, I knew that her power over me was finally and completely broken. The security camera that had saved my life 8 years earlier now sat in a place of honor on my bookshelf, next to my diploma and photos of the clients I had helped over the years. It was no longer evidence of a crime, but a symbol of the power that comes from documenting truth and refusing to let others define your reality. Sometimes the greatest victory over those who try to destroy us is simply continuing to exist, to grow, to find meaning and purpose in spite of their efforts. Diane Fletcher had tried to erase me from the world, but instead she had inadvertently helped me discover exactly who I was meant to become. The phone call came on a rainy Tuesday evening while I was reviewing intake forms for new clients at the Northwest Trauma Recovery Center. 10 years had passed since the trial, and I was now the center's clinical director, overseeing a team of 12 therapists who specialized in helping survivors of domestic violence and psychological abuse. My secretary had gone home hours earlier, so I answered the phone myself, expecting it to be one of the crisis hotline supervisors with an update on the evening's calls. Instead, I heard a voice I didn't recognize, hesitant and shaky. "Is this Dr. Zoe Harper, the one who was in the news about 10 years ago?" I set down the file I had been reading, my attention immediately focused. Over the years, I had received occasional calls from people who had seen my story in the media or heard me speak at conferences. Most were survivors seeking help or validation, though some were researchers or journalists looking for interviews. "Yes, this is Dr. Harper. How can I help you?" There was a long pause filled with the sound of someone trying to compose themselves. Finally, the voice continued. "My name is Rachel Morrison. I think Diane Fletcher tried to kill me too." The words hit me like a physical blow. I had spent years wondering if there had been other victims, other families that Diane had infiltrated and terrorized. Criminal psychologists had told me that perpetrators with her profile rarely limited themselves to a single victim, but no other cases had ever come to light during her trial or imprisonment. "Rachel, where are you right now? Are you safe?" "I'm at home. In Seattle. I saw an article about her parole hearing being denied again, and it had your name in it. I've been thinking about calling you for months, but I wasn't sure if you'd believe me." I grabbed a pen and notepad, switching into my professional mode while my personal emotions churned beneath the surface. "I believe you, Rachel. Can you tell me what happened?" The story that emerged over the next hour was eerily familiar yet uniquely horrifying. Rachel had been 14 when her mother married a man named Robert Morrison in 2003, 2 years before Diane entered my family. Robert was a widower with a teenage son, and Diane had been his girlfriend at the time, living with them in their Spokane home. She wasn't his wife then, just his live-in girlfriend. But she acted like she owned the house and everyone in it. Rachel explained, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "At first she was nice to me. Bought me clothes, helped with my homework, made me feel special. But once she felt secure in her relationship with my stepdad, everything changed." The pattern Rachel described was chillingly similar to what I had experienced. Diane had begun with subtle boundary violations, moving Rachel's belongings and claiming to have misplaced them. She orchestrated conflicts between Rachel and her stepbrother, making it appear that Rachel was the source of family tension. She gradually isolated Rachel from her friends by criticizing them, and making it difficult for her to maintain relationships. "The worst part was how she made me feel crazy," Rachel continued. "She would say things to me when we were alone, really cruel things about how my mom would be better off without me. But when I tried to tell my stepdad, she would act confused and hurt, like I was making things up." Did she ever escalate to physical threats or violence? That's the thing. I always felt like she was building up to something, but I could never prove it. Until the night she gave me those pills. Rachel went on to explain how Diane had approached her one evening when she was feeling sick with what appeared to be a stomach virus. Diane had offered her some medicine that she claimed would help with nausea, insisting that Rachel take a double dose because she was a growing teenager who needed more medication than adults. I trusted her because she was supposed to be taking care of me. But within an hour I was so disoriented I could barely stand. My heart was racing, and I felt like I was going to pass out. When I tried to call for help, she convinced my parents that I had taken the pills myself, that I was experimenting with drugs. The incident had resulted in a trip to the emergency room, where doctors found dangerous levels of antihistamines and sleep aids in Rachel's system. Diane had claimed that Rachel must have gotten into the medicine cabinet on her own, pointing to the teenager's recent behavioral problems as evidence of drug experimentation. They all believed her. Even my mom thought I had tried to get high and accidentally overdosed. The doctors, the nurses, my stepdad, everyone saw me as a troubled kid who couldn't be trusted. Diane had spent months setting up that narrative. What happened after that? My mom sent me to live with my aunt in Portland for the rest of high school. She said I needed a fresh start away from negative influences. At the time I was devastated that she was choosing Diane over me. But now I realize that Diane had probably planned it that way. She wanted me gone, and the overdose incident gave her the perfect excuse. Rachel's voice cracked as she continued. I've spent 15 years thinking I was going crazy, that maybe I really had taken those pills myself and just couldn't remember. But when I saw the article about your case, about how she tried to poison you with cleaning chemicals, I knew I wasn't imagining things. She really did try to kill me too. I spent another hour on the phone with Rachel, helping her process the validation of finally being believed and discussing options for moving forward. She had been in therapy on and off for years, struggling with anxiety, depression, and difficulty trusting her own perceptions. Learning that her experiences had been real, not imagined, was both liberating and traumatic. Do you think there are others? Rachel asked as our conversation began to wind down. I've wondered about that for years. People like Diane don't usually limit themselves to one or two victims. But finding them is difficult because her method relies on isolating victims and making them feel like they're the problem. We exchanged contact information, and I promised to connect Rachel with resources in the Seattle area. But after hanging up, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had only scratched the surface of Diane's true history. How many other families had she infiltrated? How many other children had she systematically tormented and tried to eliminate? The next morning, I called Detective Barnes, who had since been promoted to lieutenant and now supervised the domestic violence unit for Portland Police. We had maintained periodic contact over the years, and she had become something of a mentor as I developed my expertise in working with abuse survivors. I was wondering when someone else would surface, she said after I explained Rachel's call. Cases like Diane's rarely exist in isolation. The sophistication of her methods suggests she had practice. Is there any way to investigate her past relationships, look for patterns or other potential victims? Officially, the case is closed since she was convicted and is serving her sentence. But unofficially, I've always been curious about her background before she met your father. She seemed too skilled at manipulation for your family to be her first attempt. Lieutenant Barnes agreed to do some informal research into Diane's history, using resources available to law enforcement that weren't accessible to civilians. Within a week, she had uncovered information that painted a disturbing picture of Diane's past. She's moved around a lot over the past 20 years. Barnes explained during our follow-up conversation. Different cities, different relationships, always with men who had children from previous marriages. The pattern is consistent. She dates them for a year or two, moves in, and then the relationships end badly with custody disputes or allegations against the children. Allegations of what? Drug use, behavioral problems, theft, violence, always things that would make the children look unstable or dangerous. In at least 3 cases, the man's children ended up being sent away to live with relatives or in residential facilities. Barnes had found records of 4 serious relationships Diane had been in before meeting my father. In each case, she had targeted men who were recently divorced or widowed, men who were vulnerable and eager for someone to help them create a stable home environment. And in each case, any children from the man's previous relationship had been systematically removed from the picture. There's something else, Barnes continued. I found a medical examiner's report from 2001 in Phoenix. A 12-year-old boy named Marcus died of what was ruled accidental poisoning. He had been living with his father and the father's girlfriend at the time. My blood ran cold. Was the girlfriend Diane Fletcher? She was going by Diane Walsh then, but the physical description and other details match. The boy died from ingesting a combination of household chemicals that created a toxic reaction. Sound familiar? The parallels to my own case were unmistakable. Even the method was similar, though the outcome had been tragically different. Marcus had died alone in his bedroom, while Diane claimed to be running errands. The death had been ruled accidental because there was no evidence of foul play, and Diane had presented herself as a grieving stepmother figure who had tried her best to save the child. Why wasn't this connected to her other cases? She was using different names, living in different states, and the incidents were spread out over many years. Plus, most of the children survived, so they weren't investigated as potential homicides. It's only when you look at the pattern that it becomes clear what she was doing. Over the following weeks, Barnes and I worked together to identify other potential victims. Using social media, public records, and networking with law enforcement agencies in other states, we gradually uncovered a trail of destruction that spanned nearly 2 decades. We found Sarah Chen, now 31 and living in Denver, who had been systematically poisoned with small doses of prescription medications when she was 16. Her symptoms had been dismissed as teenage hypochondria until she finally collapsed at school and was hospitalized. Her father's girlfriend at the time had been Diane, who had expressed deep concern for Sarah's mental health and suggested residential treatment. There was Michael Rodriguez in Tucson, who had nearly died from carbon monoxide poisoning when the furnace in his bedroom had been tampered with. The incident had been blamed on faulty installation, but Michael remembered his stepmother to be showing unusual interest in the heating system and asking detailed questions about his room's ventilation. In Portland, we connected with James Wright, who had been 22 when Diane briefly dated his widowed father. James had experienced a series of severe allergic reactions that had required multiple emergency room visits. It was only years later that he realized someone had been systematically exposing him to allergens he had specifically told his family to avoid. Each story followed the same pattern: infiltration, manipulation, isolation, and then escalation to attempted murder disguised as accidents or medical emergencies. Diane was extraordinarily skilled at identifying vulnerable families and exploiting the natural chaos that comes with blended family dynamics. But most chilling of all was what we learned about Marcus Thompson, the 12-year-old who hadn't survived. His father, David Thompson, had committed suicide 6 months after his son's death, unable to cope with the guilt and grief. Diane had inherited his house and a substantial life insurance payout before disappearing from Arizona entirely. "She's not just a serial killer," I told Dr. Chen during one of our sessions. "She's a predator who specifically targets families in crisis. She uses the natural vulnerabilities that come with divorce and remarriage to camouflage her attacks." Dr. Chen nodded gravely. "What you're describing is extremely rare, but not unheard of. There have been cases of individuals who seek out families in transition specifically because they're easier to manipulate. The victims are usually children because they're more vulnerable and less likely to be believed if they report abuse." The weight of these discoveries was enormous. I had spent 10 years believing that I was Diane's primary victim, that our family's experience was an isolated tragedy. Learning that she had potentially killed multiple children and terrorized countless others over the course of decades was both validating and horrifying. Lieutenant Barnes compiled all of our findings into a comprehensive report that she submitted to the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. The federal agents were interested but cautious, explaining that building cases against Diane for these historical crimes would be extremely difficult. The physical evidence is either gone or was never collected in the first place. Agent Kim Martinez explained during a conference call. Most of these incidents were never investigated as potential homicides, so the crime scenes weren't properly processed. And after so many years, witness memories may not be reliable enough for prosecution. But the FBI was interested in documenting the pattern for future reference. If Diane was ever released from prison, if she ever committed additional crimes, this information could be crucial for establishing her method of operation and preventing future victims. Meanwhile, word of our investigation had begun to spread among the survivor community. I started receiving calls and emails from people who had experienced similar patterns of abuse, though not necessarily involving Diane specifically. Some were adult children who had been systematically abused by stepparents who were never held accountable. Others were parents who had lost custody of their children due to accusations that they now suspected had been fabricated. The Northwest Trauma Recovery Center became an unofficial clearinghouse for these cases, and I found myself developing protocols for documenting and investigating suspected cases of systematic family infiltration abuse. It was a new category of domestic violence that wasn't well understood by law enforcement or mental health professionals. Dr. Chen helped me process the emotional impact of learning about Diane's other victims. I felt survivor's guilt knowing that I had lived while Marcus Thompson had died. I felt anger that the system had failed to protect these children, allowing Diane to move from family to family with impunity. But I also felt a sense of purpose in finally understanding the full scope of what we were dealing with. Your survival wasn't just luck, Doctor. Chen reminded me during one particularly difficult session. You had the intelligence to document what was happening, the resources to install a security camera, and the support system to help you fight back. Not every child has those advantages. 6 months after Rachel's initial call, we had identified 12 potential victims across 7 states. Of those 12, 3 had died under suspicious circumstances that had been ruled accidental. The others had survived but carried lasting trauma from their experiences. Several had never spoken about what happened to them, afraid that no one would believe their stories. I organized a virtual support group for Diane's survivors, creating a safe space for people to share their experiences and validate each other's memories. The first meeting included 6 participants, all adults now but still processing childhood trauma that had never been properly acknowledged or addressed. For 20 years I thought I was crazy. Sarah Chen shared during one of our sessions. My therapist kept telling me to let go of the past, but how do you let go of something when you're not even sure it really happened? The group became a powerful force for healing, with members supporting each other through the process of reclaiming their narratives and understanding their experiences within the larger context of Diane's predatory behavior. Several members decided to pursue therapy with specialists in complex trauma, finally ready to address wounds that had been festering for decades. Rachel Morrison drove down from Seattle to attend one of our in-person meetings, and seeing her face-to-face was both healing and heartbreaking. She looked so much like I had at 17, carrying that particular combination of hypervigilance and self-doubt that comes from being systematically gaslit by someone who was supposed to protect you. I keep thinking about all the years I lost, she told the group. All the relationships I couldn't maintain because I didn't trust my own judgment. All the opportunities I missed because I was too afraid to believe in myself. But you survived, I reminded her.
And now you're helping other people understand that they're not alone. Your survival has meaning beyond just your own healing. The investigation into Diane's past had also attracted media attention, with several news outlets running stories about the Black Widow stepmother who had terrorized families across the country. The coverage was both helpful and frustrating. It brought more survivors forward, but it also sensationalized their experiences in ways that sometimes felt exploitative. I found myself doing numerous interviews, always trying to balance the need for public awareness with respect for the privacy and dignity of Diane's victims. The media was fascinated by the idea of a serial killer who targeted children through romantic relationships with their parents, but I tried to keep the focus on the survivors and the systemic failures that had allowed her to operate undetected for so long. The real story here isn't about one woman's capacity for evil, I told a reporter from the Washington Post. It's about how our systems consistently fail to protect children in blended families, how we dismiss their concerns as adjustment issues, and how we enable predators by refusing to believe young victims who report abuse. The article that resulted from that interview sparked a national conversation about child protection in non-traditional family structures. I received calls from family court judges, social workers, and child advocates who wanted to understand how to better identify and prevent the kind of systematic abuse that Diane had perpetrated. I began developing training materials for professionals who work with families in transition, helping them recognize the warning signs of predatory behavior disguised as relationship dynamics. The security camera that had saved my life became a central component of these presentations, demonstrating how documentation could overcome even sophisticated manipulation tactics. The technology exists to protect vulnerable family members, I would tell audiences. But we have to be willing to acknowledge that the threat exists in the first place. Too often, we're so invested in the idea of the perfect blended family that we ignore clear signs of abuse. The training program expanded rapidly, with requests coming in from law enforcement agencies, family court systems, and child protection services across the country. The Northwest Trauma Recovery Center partnered with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children to develop standardized protocols for investigating suspected cases of family infiltration abuse. 1 year after Rachel's initial call, we received news that would change everything. Diane had died in prison from complications related to liver disease, ending her eligibility for future parole hearings and closing the door on any possibility of her harming additional victims. The notification came in the same sterile format as all the others from the Department of Corrections, but the impact was profound. I felt a complex mixture of relief, sadness, and something that might have been grief.
relief that she could never hurt anyone else, sadness for the children who had died and the families that had been destroyed, and grief perhaps for the closure that would never come for those who had survived her attacks. I called each of the survivors in our support group personally to let them know. Reactions varied widely. Some felt liberated, finally free from the fear that she might someday be released. Others felt cheated out of the opportunity to confront her again as adults. A few experienced unexpected sadness, mourning not for Diane herself but for the definitive end of any possibility that she might someday acknowledge the full extent of her crimes. "It feels surreal," Rachel told me during our call. "I've spent so many years afraid of her, and now she's just gone. I don't know how to process that." "There's no right way to feel about this," I assured her. "Whatever emotions come up are valid. This is just another step in the healing process, not the end of it." The memorial service for Diane was small and private, attended only by a handful of people including her elderly sister who had maintained contact throughout her imprisonment. None of the survivors attended, though several sent statements that were read aloud acknowledging the complexity of mourning someone who had caused such profound harm. In the weeks following her death, I found myself reflecting on the strange journey that had brought me to this point. What had begun as a personal struggle for survival had evolved into a career dedicated to helping others heal from similar experiences. The security camera that had documented my near murder was now being used to train professionals across the country in recognizing and preventing family-based predatory behavior. But perhaps most importantly, the network of survivors that had emerged from our investigation had created something powerful and lasting. We had transformed from isolated victims carrying shame and self-doubt into a community of advocates working to protect other vulnerable children and families. The Northwest Trauma Recovery Center established the Marcus Thompson Memorial Fund in honor of Diane's youngest victim, providing resources for children in blended families who might be experiencing abuse. The fund offered everything from emergency safety planning to long-term therapy, creating the kind of support system that might have saved Marcus if it had existed 20 years earlier. As I stood in my office looking at the wall of thank you letters from survivors and their families, I realized that Diane's greatest failure hadn't been her inability to kill me. It had been her inability to understand that destroying one person could actually create something much more powerful, a movement dedicated to ensuring that no other child would suffer the way we had. The security camera that had saved my life remained on my bookshelf, no longer evidence of a crime but a symbol of the power that comes from refusing to let others define your reality. Next to it now sat photos of the dozens of survivors we had helped, the training programs we had developed, and the families we had protected from predators who might have operated with impunity in an earlier era. Sometimes the most profound victories emerge not from revenge or punishment, but from transformation itself. Diane Fletcher had tried to erase me and countless other children from existence. Instead, she had inadvertently created a legacy of protection, healing, and hope that would outlast her by generations. 15 years after that terrifying night when I nearly died from toxic gas poisoning, I stood in the auditorium of the International Conference on Family Violence, preparing to deliver the keynote address to over 2,000 child protection professionals from around the world. The speech I was about to give would mark the public launch of the Fletcher Protocol, a comprehensive screening and intervention system designed to identify and prevent predatory infiltration of vulnerable families. The auditorium buzzed with conversations in multiple languages as attendees settled into their seats. Social workers from Sweden sat next to family court judges from Australia. Child psychologists from Japan compared notes with police investigators from Brazil. It was exactly the kind of international collaboration that could transform how we protect children from sophisticated predators who operate across jurisdictions and continents. Backstage, I reviewed my presentation one final time, though I knew the material by heart. This speech represented the culmination of 5 years of research, development, and testing that had grown out of our investigation into Diane's other victims. What had started as a personal quest for answers had evolved into a groundbreaking approach to preventing family-based serial abuse. Dr. Chen stood beside me, now serving as the research director for the International Institute for Family Safety that we had co-founded 3 years earlier. She had been instrumental in developing the psychological frameworks that underpinned the Fletcher Protocol, helping to translate survivor experiences into scientifically rigorous intervention strategies. "Are you ready for this?" she asked, adjusting the small microphone clip to my jacket lapel. "I've been ready for 15 years, I replied, feeling the familiar weight of the security camera in my briefcase. I still carried it to every speaking engagement, not as a reminder of trauma, but as a symbol of the power that comes from documenting truth in the face of systematic deception. The conference organizer, Dr. Elizabeth Hartmann from the University of Vienna, introduced me with a comprehensive overview of my journey from survivor to international expert. She described the discovery of Diane's multiple victims, the development of new screening protocols, and the implementation of pilot programs in 12 countries that had already prevented dozens of suspected infiltration cases. As I walked onto the stage, I could see familiar faces scattered throughout the audience. Rachel Morrison sat in the third row, now a certified family advocate, who worked with our Seattle office. Sarah Chen was in the front section, having traveled from Denver, where she directed a program for adult survivors of childhood predatory abuse. James Wright had flown in from Portland, where he served on the board of the Marcus Thompson Memorial Fund. But there were also faces I didn't recognize, professionals who would be hearing this story for the first time. Some looked skeptical, probably wondering if family infiltration abuse was really significant enough to warrant an entire international protocol. Others appeared engaged but concerned, perhaps already thinking about cases in their own experience that might fit the pattern we had identified. I began with the same hook that had opened every presentation I had given over the past 5 years, a statement designed to immediately capture attention and establish the stakes involved. Imagine a predator so sophisticated that they can convince loving parents to send their own children away. Imagine someone so skilled at manipulation that they can murder a child and have it ruled an accidental death. Imagine a killer who doesn't break into homes but gets invited in, who doesn't use weapons but uses love itself as a tool of destruction. The auditorium fell completely silent, the kind of focused attention that comes when people realize they're about to hear something that could fundamentally change their understanding of a familiar problem. For decades we've focused on stranger danger and random violence, while ignoring a category of predator that specifically targets the most vulnerable families, those in transition, those grieving, those desperate for stability and hope. These predators don't need to overpower their victims because they convince the entire family to participate in their own destruction. I spent the next hour walking the audience through Diane's methodology, using anonymized case studies to illustrate how family infiltration abuse operated across different cultures and legal systems. The pattern was remarkably consistent regardless of geography: identify vulnerable families, establish romantic relationships with protective parents, systematically isolate and terrorize children, escalate to attempted murder disguised as accidents or medical emergencies. The Fletcher Protocol emerged from a simple recognition. I explained as we moved into the technical components of the presentation. Traditional child protection systems are designed to identify obvious abuse within established families. They're not equipped to recognize predatory behavior that masquerades as romantic courtship and step-parent adjustment difficulties. The protocol consisted of 5 interconnected components that worked together to create multiple layers of protection. The first was a standardized risk assessment tool that helped family courts, social workers, and medical professionals identify potential infiltration cases during routine interactions with families in transition. The assessment looked for specific warning signs that we had identified across dozens of confirmed cases: unusually rapid relationship progression, immediate attempts to assume parental authority, systematic criticism of children from previous relationships, medical emergencies that occurred only when the new partner had access to the children, and patterns of family conflict that consistently positioned the children as the source of problems. What makes this different from existing screening tools, I explained, is that it specifically looks for predatory behavior that presents as helpful or protective. Traditional abuse screening assumes that perpetrators will display obvious red flags. Infiltration predators are experts at appearing to be the solution to family problems rather than the cause of them. The second component was a documentation system that helped potential victims and their allies create detailed records of concerning incidents. This was directly inspired by the security camera that had saved my life, but it went far beyond simple video surveillance. Documentation is crucial because infiltration predators rely on gaslighting and reality distortion to maintain control, I told the audience. They convince everyone, including their victims, that concerning incidents are either imaginary or the fault of the children themselves. Systematic documentation breaks through this manipulation by creating an objective record that can't be disputed or reinterpreted. The documentation system included smartphone apps that could securely record and timestamp incidents, medical tracking tools that helped identify patterns in unexplained illnesses or injuries.
and communication platforms that allowed extended family members to compare experiences and identify inconsistencies in the predator's behavior. Rachel Morrison joined me on stage to demonstrate the smartphone app, showing how survivors could discreetly document incidents without alerting potential perpetrators. The app used advanced encryption and cloud storage to ensure that evidence couldn't be destroyed or tampered with, even if the predator gained access to the victim's device. When I was 14, I thought I was going crazy because no one believed what was happening to me, Rachel told the audience. This app would have given me a way to prove that my experiences were real, even when everyone around me was being convinced otherwise. The third component of the Fletcher Protocol was a rapid response network that connected child protection professionals across jurisdictions. One of Diane's greatest advantages had been her ability to move between states and countries, leaving behind no institutional memory of her predatory behavior. Dr. Hartman helped me explain how the response network functioned, using a hypothetical case to show how red flags in one location could trigger alerts in other jurisdictions where the suspect might have operated previously. Infiltration predators are often geographically mobile, Dr. Hartman noted. They may have criminal histories or patterns of behavior in multiple locations, but no single jurisdiction sees the complete picture. The response network allows professionals to share information safely and legally, creating a comprehensive view of potential threats. The network had already proven successful in several pilot cases. A family court judge in Toronto had used the system to identify a man who had been investigated for suspicious child deaths in 3 other provinces. Social workers in Manchester had connected concerning incidents to a pattern of similar cases across England and Scotland. In each instance, children had been protected from potential harm because professionals were able to access information that would have otherwise remained isolated in separate systems. The fourth component was specialized training for professionals who might encounter infiltration cases in their work. This training was fundamentally different from traditional child abuse education because it focused on recognizing sophisticated manipulation rather than obvious violence. Sarah Chen took the stage to explain how the training program worked, drawing on her experience as both a survivor and a professional who now worked with other victims. Traditional training teaches us to look for bruises, behavioral regression, and other obvious signs of abuse, Sarah explained. But infiltration abuse often presents as the opposite. Children may appear to be thriving initially because the predator is skilled at providing what the family needs. The concerning signs are much more subtle: changes in family dynamics, medical issues that don't quite make sense, children who seem increasingly isolated from their support networks. The training included case studies, role-playing exercises, and assessment tools that helped professionals develop the specialized skills needed to identify potential infiltration cases. Participants learned to recognize the difference between normal blended family adjustment difficulties and systematic predatory behavior. We had trained over 5,000 professionals across 6 continents, and the feedback had been overwhelmingly positive. Many participants reported that the training had helped them reframe previous cases in their experience, identifying patterns they had missed at the time. The fifth and final component of the Fletcher Protocol was a comprehensive support system for survivors and their families. This included specialized therapy approaches for infiltration trauma, support groups that connected survivors across geographical boundaries, and advocacy services that helped families navigate legal and medical systems that might not understand their experiences. Infiltration abuse creates unique trauma patterns, I explained as we reached the final section of the presentation. Survivors often struggle with severe trust issues, difficulty recognizing reality distortion, and complex grief over the loss of family relationships. Traditional trauma therapy approaches may not be sufficient to address these specialized needs. The support system we had developed included both individual and group interventions, all designed specifically for survivors of systematic family manipulation. We had treatment centers in 15 cities, with plans to expand to 30 locations over the next 3 years. James Wright joined us on stage to talk about his experience with the Survivor Support Network. As someone who had been systematically poisoned as an adult, his perspective helped illustrate that infiltration abuse wasn't limited to young children. For years I thought I was just unlucky to have so many severe allergic reactions, James told the audience. It never occurred to me that someone might be deliberately exposing me to allergens. The support group helped me understand that my experiences fit a pattern, and that understanding was the beginning of my healing process.
As the presentation moved toward its conclusion, I wanted to address the elephant in the room that I knew many audience members were thinking about: the question of whether the Fletcher Protocol was really necessary, whether family infiltration abuse was significant enough to warrant this level of systematic intervention. Some of you may be wondering if we're creating a solution in search of a problem, I said, making eye contact with several skeptical-looking faces in the audience. After all, how common can this type of abuse really be? I clicked to a slide that displayed statistics we had compiled from our research and pilot programs. The numbers were sobering. Based on our screening tools and documentation systems, we estimated that family infiltration abuse affected approximately 1 in every 800 blended families in developed countries. The rate was likely higher in regions with less robust child protection systems. That might not sound like a large percentage, I continued, but it translates to thousands of children at risk in any given metropolitan area. And because infiltration predators are often serial offenders who target multiple families over many years, the actual number of victims is much higher than initial statistics suggest. More importantly, the consequences of missing these cases were severe. Children who experienced infiltration abuse had significantly higher rates of complex PTSD, substance abuse, relationship difficulties, and suicide attempts compared to survivors of other forms of family violence. The cost of prevention is always lower than the cost of treatment, I reminded the audience. But beyond the economic argument, we have a moral obligation to protect children from sophisticated predators who exploit the very systems designed to keep families safe. The presentation concluded with a video montage featuring dozens of survivors from around the world, each sharing a brief message about the importance of recognition and prevention. The faces on screen represented every continent and multiple languages, but their messages were remarkably consistent. Infiltration abuse thrives in secrecy and isolation, but it cannot survive systematic recognition and intervention. The applause that followed was sustained and emotional, with many audience members rising to their feet. But more important than the immediate response were the conversations that began immediately afterward. During the networking break, I was surrounded by professionals who wanted to discuss implementation strategies for their own regions and institutions. Dr. Maria Santos from Mexico City talked about adapting the screening tools for Spanish-speaking populations. A family court judge from Sydney asked about legal frameworks that could support the documentation components. Social workers from Stockholm wanted to understand how the Rapid Response Network could integrate with existing child protection databases. Over the next 3 days, I participated in dozens of workshops, planning sessions, and strategy meetings as attendees worked to customize the Fletcher Protocol for their specific contexts. By the end of the conference, 23 countries had committed to implementing pilot programs, and 12 universities had agreed to conduct research studies on infiltration abuse within their regions. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came during the final evening reception, when I was approached by a young woman who introduced herself as Dr. Lisa Park, a pediatric emergency physician from Seoul. "I wanted to thank you for this work," she said, her English careful but clear. 3 months ago, I treated a child who came to our emergency room with chemical burns in her lungs. The family said it was an accident, that she had mixed cleaning products while trying to help with chores. But something felt wrong about the story. Dr. Park went on to explain how she had used early versions of our screening tools to assess the family situation. The questions had revealed concerning patterns. The child's symptoms had occurred only when her mother's new boyfriend was caring for her, and there had been several previous emergency room visits for unexplained medical issues. We were able to involve child protection services before any additional incidents occurred, Dr. Park continued. The investigation found evidence that the boyfriend had been systematically exposing the child to dangerous substances. Without your framework, I would have assumed it was an accident and sent her home to potentially die. This was exactly why we had developed the Fletcher Protocol. Not just to honor the memory of victims like Marcus Thompson, but to prevent future tragedies by giving professionals the tools they needed to recognize sophisticated abuse when they encountered it. As I flew home to Portland the next day, I reflected on how far we had come since that terrifying night 15 years earlier, when I had awakened to find my room filled with toxic gas. What had begun as a desperate attempt to document the truth about my own experience had evolved into an international movement that was protecting children around the world. The security camera that had saved my life now sat in the Smithsonian Institution as part of an exhibit on innovation and child protection. But its real legacy wasn't in a museum display case.
Its legacy was in the thousands of professionals who now knew how to recognize infiltration abuse, the hundreds of survivors who had found healing through specialized support services, and the countless children who would never become victims, because we had learned to identify and stop predators before they could complete their deadly work. Uncle Troy met me at the airport, his hair now completely gray, but his smile as warm as ever. He had become the honorary grandfather to dozens of the children we had helped protect over the years, offering them the kind of unconditional love and support that every child deserves. "How did it go?" he asked as we drove through the familiar streets of Portland. "We're going to save a lot of kids," I replied, feeling the deep satisfaction that comes from work that truly matters. That evening, I visited the cemetery where my mother was buried, bringing fresh flowers and sharing the news from the conference. I told her about the 23 countries that had committed to implementing our protocols, about Dr. Park and the child in Seoul, who had been saved from further abuse, about the network of survivors who had transformed their trauma into protection for others. "I think you would be proud of what we've built," I said to her headstone. "It's not the life I thought I'd have, but it's meaningful in ways I never could have imagined." As I walked back to my car, my phone buzzed with a text message from Rachel Morrison. She had just finished facilitating a support group session in Seattle, and one of the new members had made a breakthrough in understanding their own experience. "Another survivor found their voice tonight," the message read. "This work matters more than we'll ever fully know." She was right. Every child we protected, every survivor we helped heal, every professional we trained to recognize sophisticated abuse, represented a victory over the kind of evil that Diane Fletcher had embodied. We couldn't bring back Marcus Thompson, or undo the trauma that so many children had endured, but we could ensure that their suffering had meaning by preventing others from experiencing similar harm. The Fletcher Protocol would continue to evolve and expand, adapting to new technologies and changing social structures. Infiltration predators would undoubtedly develop new methods and approaches, but they would now face a world that understood their tactics and had systems in place to stop them. Sometimes the most powerful response to evil isn't revenge or punishment, but transformation itself. By turning our collective trauma into protection for others, by refusing to let predators operate in the shadows of ignorance and isolation, we had created something that would outlast any individual perpetrator or victim. The little security camera that had documented my near murder had become the foundation for a global movement. What started as one teenager's desperate attempt to prove she wasn't crazy had evolved into an international protocol that would protect children for generations to come. That was a legacy worth building. That was a victory worth celebrating. And that was proof that sometimes the most ordinary tools, in the hands of someone determined to survive and protect others, can change the world. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.